All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I got a lot to cover today. Good morning to you all. Happy Monday morning. Hope you guys had a great weekend. We're going to start today discussing a whole bunch of different things, but mostly it's advanced Photoshop that we're going to be getting into today. So anyway, I have a bunch of slides to go through, then we'll do a little bit of demo, and then you guys will have your check-ins today if you're scheduled for Monday. I know we've done some shuffling with different students moving around. Hopefully everybody feels settled at this point. I also got a bunch of assignments lab exercises turned in last night, so that's excellent. If you're struggling to get those things turned in or Canvas isn't working for you, that's what the check-ins are before, and we'll make sure that you get it turned in as expected. So let me go ahead and get started. Let me share my screen here. And let's see here. We got to move things around. Hold on. Perfect. So we're going to get started. We're going to talk about high dynamic range photography, panoramas, and also something called blending modes. And all three of them are important photographic techniques, and they really lead themselves well into the next layer of what we're going to be working in Photoshop. So we'll start first with high dynamic range. And so HDR photography, or high dynamic range photography, is designed to mimic what your eye sees in the world. And its technical definition is that it's a dynamic range of luminances between the lightest and darkest areas of the image. And so this is something that you've probably experienced in practice, where you've gone to a particular site, you've looked at a sunset. I think that's probably the best example of all of them, but you've gone to a sunset, and when you go to look at that sunset, it looks a lot better than when you try to take a picture of it. And that's because our eye is so much better at processing what's called high dynamic range. So we can see what's happening in the dark areas of the picture. We can see what's happening in the light areas of the picture, and we adjust really quickly as we look from one area to the other. In the world of photography, though, we don't have the option of quickly jumping from one exposure to another. We have a set exposure. So in this series of 3 slides, we can see that there are 3 different exposures that were taken with the camera. The one in front here was designed to show us the detail that's in the shadows of the images. The one in the middle is kind of the general, quote, correct exposure. And then we have one last that's really dark photo that's really about the lighter areas of the picture. And we can, through Photoshop, fuse those together to create the image of the sunset. And this image, theoretically, is very close to what our eye actually sees in a particular scene. So why do we even care? Why am I even talking about high dynamic range photography? Well, first off, it's a more accurate way of representing the wide range of light found in a particular scene. So you can more accurately represent what it looks like to be in a particular space. We're basically mimicking how the eye sees a particular scene. And so we're doing that through a process called tone mapping in Photoshop. There is a whole nother side of this. And those of you that have taken my 136 class, we've worked with HDR images quite a bit. And that is that we can create these images as a backdrop for renderings. And when we contain all of this information inside an HDR, they actually don't look that great until we go through a rendering engine. We render them out, and the background changes based on the camera settings in the rendering engine. So it's a kind of a high-level use of an HDR image, but definitely something that's in practice that you'll experience, certainly if you take 136, but as you go forward in a design career. So it's important to be aware of the concept. So this tone mapping, I mentioned this a little bit before. This tone mapping is designed to look at different areas of an image and create kind of micro contrast between what's happening in the image so that we can see correct exposure in the dark areas of the image and correct exposure in the lighter areas of the image. And that's really what this process is about. And ultimately, it creates a lower dynamic range so that we can see it all at once. So it's fusing these images together. And that's really what we're going to be working on in Photoshop today. So it reduces that dynamic range, or the contrast ratio, of the entire image while retaining localized contrast. So the lighter areas of the image have nice contrast in them. The darker areas of the image have nice contrast in them, but we don't have an overall too dark portion or an overall too light portion of a particular image. So we have some different software choices for tone mapping. There are some professional options. There are some hobbyist options. The first one is obviously Photoshop, and that's what we're covering in this class to begin with. So we're going to work with Photoshop today to merge these images into one image. Now, I asked you back in exercise 103 to attempt to take a bracketed set of images. If you were able to take this bracketed set, that's great. We can use your images to do this HDR. If you didn't, that's okay. I have sample files that I'll give you so that you can play around with it and you don't have to worry if your images weren't quite right. So when we do this, the merge to HDR is an automated action in Photoshop. It's set up for us. We select the images and it merges them together. It then presents us with the dialog box where we can kind of deal with some of the post-processing techniques. We can deal with some of the tone mapping. It's not quite as good as some of the standalone applications. I'll show you some examples of those a little bit later, but it's a great way of introducing the idea of masking. And that's really what today will ultimately be about. So there are a couple other software options out there. One is called Photomerge. It's for a long time been considered to be the gold standard in tone mapping. It has plugins for Photoshop or Lightroom if you're a professional photographer. It also is a standalone application. So depending on what it is that you're after, you can actually purchase this. You could probably get a student license for it if something that becomes interesting to you. It does a great job of kind of automating this process. Aurora HDR is kind of a newcomer on the scene. They claim that they use artificial intelligence to process these images. I think it does a pretty good job. I've played around with it before. It's a little bit on the expensive side for what it's doing, but it's certainly something, if you're interested in it, you can play around with it. But like I said, we're going to work primarily in Photoshop today. So I have a bunch of examples here that I want to show you. And when we look at these examples, I want to point out another good place where this HDR really comes into play. And so when we look at HDR, this is two images of the same floor on a particular building. And so if you, for example, if you take a second and think about yourself as maybe a real estate agent or somebody who's deciding to rent this particular space. Let's say you have an up and coming company, you're looking for office space and you want to be able to rent this particular space. If you're looking online and you look at this image, you'd say, okay, well, that's a nice space. It looks like it has a nice floor. The windows look pretty nice, but I wonder what it looks at. Because in this particular image, which is not an HDR, when we look out the windows, all we see is the white overexposed background. So there could, in this spot right there, be some really ugly thing that you'd be looking at and you wouldn't know. So if we use the concept of a high dynamic range photo in this context, we can actually benefit a lot. So the bottom one, so if we come down here to this image, this is an HDR. So I'll make a note, HDR, not HDR. Okay, so if we look at this bottom one that is the HDR, we can tell that this is actually a view of the skyline of the city. We get a lot more information out of what's happening in this photo. And theoretically, if we were the real estate agent trying to sell the space, we could entice more people to want this or pay more for it because of that view. So there's a distinct difference between these two images, and the HDR really makes a difference when we're trying to look at this space in context. Another example here, kind of side by side, of the standard photography on the left and the HDR photography on the right. If you've ever looked at real estate listings or apartment photos, you're searching for a house to rent, you'll see that a lot of the professional photos are all high dynamic range photos. And that's because there aren't any shadows or dark areas. Everything in the image appears bright with lots of detail. So that's what's happening here. We have the standard on the left, we have the HDR on the right. The image of the HDR looks a lot more enticing than the darker image on the left. Same thing on this lower set of images. We're really not getting the full feeling of what that view looks like until we jump over into the HDR image. Now, it does have a little bit, if we look at the plant here, for example, the high dynamic range sometimes does some weird things with green objects or with plants, and that's a telltale sign that it's a high dynamic range image in that how it's processed. So the plant there is a little bit over green, but it's not about the plant. It's really about the view in these windows, and that's what we're concerned with in showing this. Another example here, this was done with the Aurora HDR. We could see the image on the left is the standard image. The image on the right is the high dynamic range image. Gives a little bit more detail, a little bit more definition, makes that building look a little bit more appealing. Another example here, I'm going to start flipping a little bit faster through some of these examples. Sometimes they look like a normal image. So this is an example of a high dynamic range image that really looks like a typical image. The difference is just right in here in the shadows. Just a little bit more definition in the shadows. It's not over dark. Another time when these images are useful is kind of that twilight, where we're trying to bring out the lights of a building, etc. If you've ever noticed, building photographers love to shoot at this time. And that's because the lights are on in the building, it makes it glow. But if we were shooting this in a non-HDR format, all of this down here at the bottom, all those bushes, those would end up just too dark, and we'd have a dark bottom to the image, and we would really lose a lot of that definition. So by switching to high dynamic range, we're getting more definition out of that whole bottom section in addition to that particular image. All that being said, I think this image would be a lot stronger if we chopped it right here and got rid of this part, so that this was on that rule of thirds. But that's just a callback to what we were talking about in overall composition. I didn't take the image, I'm just pointing it out. Another example here with high dynamic range looks relatively normal. Looks like you would see it in a particular scene on kind of an overcast day, but all of this down in here would be overly dark if we expose this correctly without a high dynamic range image. So we'd lose that cantilevered, we'd lose those little blocks and the louvers, those would all get lost in the details. So it's a good advantage to shoot with high dynamic range. Now, I've talked all about a high dynamic range, and the logical question would be, well, wait a minute, why would I not always shoot in high dynamic range? Well, it's a good question. So this is an example of a high dynamic range image, and there's a fundamental problem in it. Actually, there's a couple fundamental problems in it. And that occurs whenever there's movement in a scene. So if I focus your attention right down here to the car. So because this is a fusion of 3, 5, or 7 images total, objects that move in the scene often create distortions or abnormalities in a particular photo. So we can look here, the license plate occurs 3 times. Because that car was moving. Likewise, when we blended this together, look at this person. So the person's feet are quite solid, but the person has no head. So these kinds of abnormalities do happen because we're fusing multiple images together. So anything that's moving quickly in an image is going to cause these kinds of distortions in the overall image. So they work great, especially when there's no people or no movement, but they don't work as well when there are people or movement or cars in a particular scene. So that's definitely something to be aware of when you're looking at a high dynamic range image. Another example here, very realistic, but we're getting good definition in the shadows in addition to good definition in the fully exposed sunlit areas of the image. Another example. So this image obviously has cars and boats in it, but they're not moving. So we can get good quality HDR out of that. So a lot of these I'm just kind of flipping through so that you can start to see. Those were the images that I showed earlier where I had the 3 different exposures. And I think this is one of the sample sets of images that I'll give you to play around with. This is on the California coast. I think I give you that one too as a sample set. So those were all in the realistic example area, where we're really trying to make the image look realistic. Now, we can take this concept much further, and we can push the boundaries of what an image actually looks like. And when we do that, we tend to make these images feel almost ethereal or surreal, where they're not quite realistic anymore. So there's almost like a ghostly quality or something that's different about the image, where you can tell it's pretty, but it's almost painterly in its end result. So an image like this is great. The use of HDR and the overexposure of the clouds and the darkness, that really doesn't tend to happen in real life unless we're in the middle of wildfire season or something. But it's really a great example of kind of making this house feel more haunted than it really is. So you can extend these images much further. So obviously the sky didn't really look like this, but it's become almost painterly because of that overexposed nature of the image. You guys have been to the Golden Gate Bridge before, and unless it was the end of the world, I don't think the clouds or the sky would look like this. So they're pushing the boundaries of what can happen, and this is becoming a surreal picture rather than a realistic picture. We'll talk about panoramas a little bit later in this lecture, but this is a panoramic photo that is also a high dynamic range photo. And again, the clouds are kind of overexposed. They're pushing the envelope of realism here. I think this one is more just oversaturated than anything else. This one, if we look down at the texture of the wood, I think that's the biggest telltale, is it's just way overdone. And we're losing a lot of the details, kind of too much. Now, of course, the quality of the image isn't the best either, but that's definitely extending beyond. Another example here where the mood of the image is really enhanced by the HDR, but it didn't really look like that. So this one is certainly a realistic scene, but there's something about how orange everything turned out that just makes it a little bit over-processed. So that is high dynamic range photography. And so we've covered high dynamic range photography. Now we're going to switch into panoramic photography. And there is definitely some overlap between these two subjects. Panoramas are something that I spent a lot of time really researching and studying and writing about through my undergraduate years and into grad school. And it's interesting to see how much panoramas have progressed versus back, when I was first starting in, the early 2000s about them. So now we have a lot more flexibility, a lot more options. Heck, our phones create the images by themselves. They stitch images together. So it's become much easier to take panoramas. But what is a panorama? Panorama is fundamentally a really wide angle view of a particular space. A 360 panorama is one that goes all the way around. So we could unroll, if we had a piece of paper, we could unroll that piece of paper and it would go all the way around us to create the view. So unless we're using our phones to kind of create this, basically it involves stitching together lots of images. Usually those images are really wide angle images, and we put those together to create the panorama, and we stitch them together so that they become seamless. When you use your phone to create a panorama, you're essentially doing the same thing. The difference is that the software is putting them together as you swing your phone around versus having to do the manual assembly after the fact. There are some mechanics that are important, and we'll end up with, and let me skip forward a slide. I want to show you the problem first, and then we'll come back here. You've probably had this happen in a panorama image, or if you've ever looked at Google Street View, you find that these things happen all the time. These errors are something called parallax, and it's when the images don't really stitch together correctly. And that's usually when the camera has moved in relation to the panorama. And so let's jump back here for a second and look at the mechanics. There is a point inside the lens of a camera, whether it's in your phone or whether it's a digital SLR camera, where the image comes in through the lens and it actually flips upside down because it's passing through the lens. Same thing happens with our eyes, flips upside down and then projects onto the light sensitive material. Same thing happens in our eyes. As it comes through, everything is actually upside down and our brains just switch it right side up. Maybe you guys have seen that study where people put on the glasses and they have mirrors in them that flip the world upside down, and within 24 hours, our brains correct it. Anyway, it's pretty cool. But that's part of the optics of our eye, optics of a camera lens. If we can isolate that point is called the nodal point, and we move the camera around that point, rather than swinging the camera in a big arc, we can eliminate these parallax problems. So here's an example of the mechanics. Depending on how we move it, right? If we just turn the camera not on the nodal point, the two images won't align. So if we look here, there we're shooting straight on at this object and this object. If we shift the camera not on the nodal point, so it's actually in front of the nodal point right now, when we go to take the picture, the center object is here, but the rear object is way over here. And you can actually do this with your phone. You can see this happen. If we move around the nodal point, so the camera is moved back so that it moves around the nodal point, those two objects will stay in alignment as we swing the camera around. And that gives us better results without this parallax problem. So right here, there's parallax problems. Another example here with the edge or the seam, those lines don't quite match up. This is kind of severe, and Google Street View is prone to these kinds of things. And that's because they're taking pictures as the cameras are moving. But where this building, the arc of the building, really doesn't line up correctly. So we can improve some of that with our post-processing. What becomes the final results? Well, you've all experienced Street View. You've gone in there, you can look around at a particular image. We can create these interactive movies so that you can look at a particular space. You can also create an unfolded flat version of these images, which I'll show you a bunch of examples a little bit later. So software, how do we process these images? Well, guess what? First one is Photoshop, no surprise. That's what we're gonna be doing in this class. It's available on the lab computers, which is great. It's available on your home computers, hopefully by now. It's really good at stitching small groups of images together. So if you pick 9 images, 10 images, it should be able to stitch those together really well. If you have a full 360 and you throw, you know, I don't know, 50 images at it, it doesn't do quite so well. Just like with the high dynamic range image, it is a fully automated process. So you just throw the images at Photoshop and it figures out where they line up, which is pretty cool. I'll do that as an example for you live today, and then you guys will do it as part of your exercises for today. There are 2 other pieces of software that people use to stitch panoramas primarily. One program is called PTGUI. Both of these tools are built on something called PanoTools, which is an open source program. This is just the graphic user interface for it. PTGUI is awfully good, and what this program and the program that I'll show you next do is they look at an image and identify similar points in the image, and then it'll actually warp and twist the images to match up to eliminate a lot of those parallax errors, which is a pretty cool piece of software. You can manually pick points or you can automatically pick points. The other version, this one is paid. The other version is something called Huggin, which is right here. If you're interested in stitching together images or panoramas and you want to play around with this, Huggin is free. It's open source. It's awesome. It takes a little bit longer than the PTGUI to do the processing, and that's because it's open source, but hey, it's free. The one thing I will point out is that the latest version that was released in 2020, so it's a little bit behind. I don't know what's happening with the development, but you know, maybe people with the pandemic had better things to do. So it's not quite current, but it's still definitely worth playing around with. Google Street View is an iOS application or an Android application that lets you actually do these images live. I took one, I don't know, 10 years ago on the beach in Hawaii. For the fun of it, I was playing around with this stuff and I posted it on their website. And I don't know, several years ago, I got a notification that I think it was over 500,000 people had viewed my image. It was really weird. But you can do it. And this is a way that Google's trying to facilitate additional photos to look at in their Street View process, especially when the cars can't reach a particular location. Certainly something you can play around with. It doesn't work particularly well indoors. So whenever you're in a confined, closed space, it doesn't work as well, but it's great for outdoor. So where is this whole thing going? Well, we're creating all these panoramas, which is great. We're getting to the point where we can actually start to take 360 video, this immersive content where you're shooting live video in this 360. You could then watch it in a pair of goggles and actually look around at what's happening. I know they've done some TV shows that are in this now, where you can actually kind of look around and interact. Well, you can't really interact with the actors, but you can feel like you're part of the action rather than just watching it play out, which is kind of an interesting use case. And it's certainly something that we're kind of slowly tumbling toward. And it'll be interesting to see over the next 10 years how this kind of plays out. So let's look at some examples of panoramas. This is that Tambo, Colorado site with the preserved paintings in the desert of Peru that I visited back in 2004. And I took a bunch of panoramas while I was there. One of the things that's important to point out is that in a panorama, in an unrolled panorama like this one, walls that are, or objects that are straight in real life and come to 90-degree corners, in the world of a panorama end up being curved objects. And so you can see that the walls look warped, but they are in fact straight. And if you imagine curling this back on itself, it would end up kind of correcting those distortions. It's also important to point out that if you mess up when you're taking the groups of images, there being a good example, I had an exposure that wasn't correct. And when you go to blend it after the fact, you can end up with a mistake. Now, of course, that's something I left it in for this, but that's an easily fixable process in Photoshop. We could correct that problem after the fact. Another example here of a panorama. When they have the scalloped edges on it, it usually means that they weren't a full 360. It's just one set or two sets of images that go around in a circle. So we don't have the full 360. This is up in the highlands of Peru. So here's another example. This was supposed to be a full 360. And when I was taking the images, I conveniently forgot to take a few images here. So if I wanted this to show as a full 360, I would need to go in after the fact and do some collage work in Photoshop to kind of fill that stuff in. So as I said, objects that are straight appear curved in a panorama, but curved objects appear straight in a panorama. So this is a full 360, and it's taken right at the center of the crop circles at Marai. So I was right there when I took that image. So you can see this is a perfect illustration of all those walls appear relatively straight. And the reason that they appear relatively straight is because in reality, they're circular. This is another example of a 360 panorama. This is Ollantaytambo in Peru. Actually, it's across from the site. Looking at it, you can see the site is right there. One of the great things about a panorama image, though, is we have huge detail. So if we were to zoom in, we could actually get incredible detail of what's happening across the way through that doorway. This is one of the examples that I have for you guys to play around with. It's stitched together particularly well, so you can kind of mess around with that as an example. Here's another example. Sometimes mistakes happen. There's a little bit of somebody's toes that made their way into the image. And this was really, for me, this was the image that got me started in being interested in panoramas. They have a similar issue to the high dynamic range images because we're taking a whole series of images and then stitching all of those images together. The same thing starts to happen where people that move through the space end up being ghosts. And so that movement is captured as these little ghosted objects as part of the panorama. This is Worcester Hall at Berkeley. And this is the architecture building. You guys, if you end up transferring, will spend a lot of time here. You probably won't see it like this. This is during the day. You're more likely to see it like this, which is at night. So this is the night view of Worcester Hall. And you'll probably spend most of your time looking at it there. Again, straight objects appear curved. Curved objects appear straight. This was a silly example. I think we did it in like 2002 or 3. This was a friend and I when we were in school. Now, if you take a moment, you look at the computers that are in here. They were the old Emacs back in the day, or there's an awful old Windows computer there. So this is what we were dealing with back when we were working on these projects. But we played around with the idea that you could repeat objects in a scene. So on each one of these photos, we were in every one of the photos. So you can see us repeated over and over again. This was back when I had hair, which is always kind of exciting. And so you could see us appear throughout the photo, and that's kind of the point. So if you understand the concept, you can play around with it. This was at the Chabot Space and Science Center. Again, a series of images. And again, something that you have to be aware of is that if somebody walks through the image, you may end up with a half a person, etc. This was on the Brooklyn Bridge in New York, a handheld shot. I isolated the nodal point of my camera and I took the images. Today, you'd take your phone and you'd swing it through, although really you should move around your phone. You'd get better results if you were taking it. This is out in the Alameda Naval Air Station. So I'm going to start flipping through these a little bit faster. Actually, I think this one is one of the ones that I'm giving you as an example too, that you can play around with. You can get creative about how these are put together. This was taken on a roof in San Francisco. And instead of having the horizon straight, this was a friend's image. He warped the horizon to create this kind of composition, which is kind of fun. These are images out of my thesis. I did my thesis on the airport, and it had to do with panoramas and moving through space and transposition of spaces, etc. But what ended up being kind of fun is I started to create series of drawings where I was actually drawing these panoramas rather than just photographing them. So a lot of the big drawings that were in my thesis were created through this kind of drawing strategy. And so there's an example of all the pieces and how they play together. So the last concept that we're going to talk about in lecture format today, and we're about halfway through, which is good, is the concept of blending modes in Photoshop. And this is something that we use quite extensively. And I want to get you familiar with it now. I'll show you in the slide format, but it's really one of those hands-on things where when we demonstrate it in the live setting, it'll be a little bit easier to understand. So I'll do my best to explain it verbally. Blending modes are basically how you apply layers to one another. And so I think the easiest way to explain this is if I were to do a drawing on a piece of paper, like I took a piece of paper out and I did a drawing on it, and then I took that piece of paper and I put a piece of trace paper over the top of it, and then I drew over the top of it, the drawing that I made on top of the tracing paper would affect what the overall drawing looks like. Now, if I took that white piece of paper and I put the white piece of tracing paper on it, and I took a yellow piece of tracing paper and I put it over the top of it, it would tint the whole drawing yellow. So what blending modes are doing in a software way is they're controlling how that layer on top is applying to the layer below. So it's allowing you to actively blend one layer into another using a specific method. So we're going to talk about what those methods are, but it's basically broken down into groups. We have normal, which is one image is on top of the other. Then we have a group, the second group here, that generally darken the image. They make it darker. So those are the darkening. We're going to work primarily with this one right there that's called multiply today. Then we have generally the lightening parts of the image, and we'll work primarily today with screen. Then we have contrast. This lightens the light areas and darkens the dark areas, and that is overlay. And so we'll work with overlay. Actually, you guys have already worked with overlay once. When we did the dodging and burning, we worked with overlay. And then we get down here into the bottom section. Those are all more advanced topics. We will touch on luminosity today just a little bit. So, like I said, we're going to work primarily with multiply, screen, and overlay. A little bit later in the class, we'll work with soft light as well. But for our purposes today, primarily multiply, screen, and overlay. Okay, illustrations of blending modes. So what I have here as a sample, and you guys will end up downloading this sample to play around with today as well. I have two layers in Photoshop. The bottom layer is just blue background. And on top of that blue background, I have three squares, a black square, a gray square, 50% gray, and a white square. And then I have a gradient that goes from black to white. Now, when I stack those up on Photoshop, they're going to look like this. This has a normal blending mode applied. When that happens, we're seeing the black square, the gray square, the white square, and the gradient all on top of the blue, as if they were just a piece of paper laying on top of the blue. Now, when we change the blending mode, first one I'm going to do is to multiply. So I'm changing right over here, this layer into multiply. So I'm taking layer one and changing it into multiply. When this happens, right, we're going to see that the lighter areas become transparent and the darker areas get darker. So let's look at it happen. Okay, so I just applied it. What was white? So this area right here has become completely transparent. Likewise, the lighter section of the gradient has become transparent. The middle gray has made the blue a little bit darker, and the black has made the blue really dark. So let me back that up. I'm going to show you one more time in process. And there it is. So let's go forward into the next one. Next one, we're paying attention to the same squares. This is the screen blending mode right there. So this is the opposite's going to happen. So the dark areas are going to become transparent. The middle areas will make the blue a little bit lighter, and the white areas will make the blue really white, if not white. And there's that application. Turns out that in this example, my black was a really dark gray. It wasn't a true black. Otherwise, that would be completely transparent. But you get the idea here. So once again, when I apply the screen, the dark areas are going to become transparent. The middle areas will be lighter, and the white areas will be white. Overlay. So in an overlay, we're going to keep the middle, the gray in the middle is going to become transparent. The white will get lighter, and the dark will get darker. Like that. So in this scenario, the dark gets darker blue, the white gets lighter blue, and the middle becomes transparent. Again, I think these are easier to understand when we do them live, but I want to at least go through and show you those examples. Okay, so those are the live lecture examples. I'm going to switch out of this, I hope. There we go. And I'm going to pull up my remote desktop. There you go. Hopefully you guys can still see this. And in the process, I thought I pulled it up. No, I didn't pull it up here. I'm going to have to pull it up on my my home computer here. I've gone ahead and I've pulled up our exercise 105.6 for today. This is in Canvas. Remember, I'm posting all of the exercises and the assignments on Canvas now. So I've gone ahead and I've pulled this one up. What I'd like for you to do, and I'm going to actually give you a few minutes to do it, I'd like you to go ahead and log in, find exercise 105.6, and I want you to download this sample file. It's ps-blendingmodes.psd. You'll need to right-click on it and say Save Link As. And when you do that, and it shows up down here in the bottom, let me click Save. It's probably going to throw this little error saying, we can't verify it's safe. Well, you want to click that little up arrow and choose to keep, and then it will actually download the file. Now I've gone ahead and I've put it in my OneDrive folder so that I can open it on the remote desktop. If you're using your native copy of Photoshop, you can just download it to your downloads folder, and that's fine. So I'm going to give you guys a minute or so to do that. In the meantime, I'm going to jump back over into my remote desktop, and I'm going to go ahead and open up that file.
It's actually not letting me open mine or download it.
Did you choose keep?
Let's see. It's not really giving me the option. Oh wait, let's see.
Right click and say Save Link As, or Save Download As, or something like that.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Oh, okay. No, it worked. Okay. Thank you.
No problem. So I'll give you guys another minute to get here. This is one of those really hard ones to do live because, you know, back when I used to be able to teach in person, I could walk around and make sure you all had this on your computers, and then you could look at mine. And you know, we're in this world where you're trying to see my shared screen and download it and whatever. So we'll do the best we can, but it helps to kind of do this together, and then we'll move into the other demos and go from there. So we'll give it a little bit more time. And then worst case, you can just watch me do it and then do it after on the recording. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and keep going. Again, the reason that I'm doing this on the remote desktop and not my personal machine is so that I can have my mouse clicks recorded for the recording process. So I have Photoshop opened up here. This is what you're seeing. You should be seeing the same thing that I'm seeing. I can press Control-0 or Command-0 on the Mac. Control-0, let's see, there we go, to make this a little bit bigger so you can see it a little bit better. So like I said, I have two layers. I actually have four layers here, but the layers we're going to concentrate on right now are layer 1 and the background layer. The background layer, as I said, is just blue. And on top of that blue layer, you can see the checkerboard means it's transparent. I have these 3 squares and the gradient at the bottom, exactly what I showed in lecture. So if I have both of those on and I click on layer 1 here, and I come up into the layers palette, it currently says normal. So if I click on that normal, we see, hey, there's the list of all those blending modes. And one of the cool things is that as we scroll through it, you can actually see how these various options change without picking them. So the first example would be multiply. So if I switch to multiply, the white becomes transparent and the darker areas of the image become darker. If I come down to screen, the white stays white, but the dark areas become transparent. And if I come all the way down to overlay, the middle area becomes transparent and the lighter areas become lighter and the darker areas become darker. So you are probably wondering why I've spent so much time concentrating on this. Well, let me show you an actual example where this starts to matter. So let me turn off layer 1 for a second, and I'm going to turn on layer 2. So layer 2, this was a JPEG image that came out of SketchUp. So it's just a saved image from SketchUp. It's a white background and it has black lines on it. So let's say that I wanted to cut out the background. I ultimately wanted to put a sunset behind this structure, whatever it is. Well, I could go in and I could try to actually delete all the white parts and make it transparent. Or here's a perfect opportunity to use a blending mode to make it transparent. So I can select layer 2 and come over here and change my blending mode to multiply. And when I do that, it's made the white area completely transparent, but it's kept all of the black lines for me. And that's a really useful way of getting rid of that white backdrop. Now I could do the same thing. I have the inverse, where I have white lines on a black background. The difference here is that instead of picking multiply, right, I'd come down here and I'd pick screen. And that would cause the black to go away. And then I'd end up with the white lines staying solid. So this is kind of an introduction to the idea of blending modes. And I do that so that it matches up with what I just showed in lecture. But we're going to need to move forward and actually do some stuff on blending modes in photos so you can see where and how they would apply to photos. So what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to go online and find an old photograph that you might want to enhance. So let me go, I'm going to do a Creative Commons search. So let me do search.creativecommons.org. Whoops, not supposed to be videos. No, I'm going to stick with this one for right now. And I'm going to search, let's search on Flickr for old faded photo. And the advantage of using a Creative Commons search, or you can do a Google search but also in I'm getting terrible results. Let's make sure that it's in black and white on the search here. And let's pick this one. Okay, it's kind of faded. So let's see if we can make this one a little bit better. So I'm using the Creative Commons search, or I could do Google image search. The key is that I want it to allow, I want it to be Creative Commons licensed, so that, because I'm borrowing somebody else's picture. Let's go ahead and download the original size. And let's show it. There it is. It's in the downloads folder. I'm going to go ahead and open this. So let's open with, and of course, Photoshop is not the default, which is ridiculous. Let's open it with Photoshop. And there's that image that I found. So try to find an older image like this, and we're going to start to play around with how do we work with these blending modes to enhance the image. So on the first one, let's work on darkening up the darks. So now we could, of course, use a levels adjustment to work with it, but let's try the blending modes for right now. So we have our background image, which is our primary image. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to create a duplicate of this layer. So we actually have two images on top of each other. So I'm going to use the layers palette here. I'm going to go over to the little I think it's 4 lines on the right side here, and choose duplicate layer, which I'm not seeing. Where is it? There it is, right there, duplicate layer. And we can just name it the background copy. That's fine. And now on that background copy layer, I'm going to change the blending mode into multiply. And you'll see that as soon as I do that, it's darkened all the darks of the image and really hasn't done too much to the lighter areas of the image. Now, maybe this is a little bit strong, so I can use the opacity slider right here to control how strong I want that multiplication to be. So there's probably a point that makes it look pretty good. So that one's with the multiply. So let me just go ahead and call this one multiply. I'm going to do the same thing with a screen mode. Now, for you guys, when you're working through this, you can pick different images each time, or we can work with the same images. So the next one is going to be screen. So let me duplicate this again. So I'll take the background and I'll come over here and I'll choose to duplicate my layer. And let's call this one screen. And so this time on the screen layer, we'll turn off multiply. We'll go to the screen layer and we'll change it to screen. So now when this one happens, we see that it's lightened up the lighter areas of the image. It's really kind of like blown out the image a little bit. So maybe that's a little bit too strong. So we could choose how much, using that opacity slider, we wanted to lighten that image. So we have an example here where we've darkened the image. We have an example here where we've lightened the image. Now, I bet you guys can all see where this is going. We're going to do it one more time, and this time we're going to use the overlay. So let me turn off multiply and screen. We'll duplicate the background one more time. And this is going to be overlay. Now, in the overlay, remember that's going to darken the darks and lighten the lights. So we can see that that has taken the original image and darkened up those darks, but also lightened up the lights, which in my opinion has done a lot to improve this overall image. There was the original, kind of faded, and there's the processed image after the fact. Again, if this is too strong, you can use the opacity slider to control how much that's applying. So as we go forward in the exercise, and you'll see, let me bring that one back up here. Oops, sorry, wrong page. There it is. So I'm going to ask you so part 1, we already did that. There's no post, there's nothing to save for part 1. Part 2, we're going to do multiply. Part 3, we're going to do screen. Part 4, we're going to do overlay. So those 3 parts, we need to go ahead and save. So I'll come over to back to Photoshop. and I'm going to save each of these. So let's start with the multiply. I'll turn this one on. Actually, let's start with the original. Start with the original here. I'm going to go to File, and I'm going to go to Export, and then Export As. We're going to change the format to JPEG. Now, some of you had some trouble with posting in the last, for exercise 104. It may have come from the size. So we're uploading a lot of images again. So I'm going to change the width to be 1,000. And that's going to drop the size quite a bit. And that's really all we need. I'm just asking for proof that you did this work. So it's a pretty small file now. Let's go ahead and export it. And I need to put it in today's folder. Let's go here. And I'm going to call this one original. And I'll click save. Perfect. Now I'll turn on the multiply. Oops, sorry, I have to leave the background on. I'll turn on the multiply. And I'll go to File, Export, Export As. Change the size down to 1,000. We'll click Export. And this is now going to be multiply. And I'll click Save. And then you see where this is going. We'll do it for screen, File, Export, Export As. 1,000. And we'll call this one screen. And you would do the same thing for the multiply. From here, let's see if I pull that back up. So that's part 1, 2, and 3. So you'd end up with 4 images total for that. Oh, excuse me, 2, 3, and 4. Next one, we're going to work on something called luminosity. Okay, so in luminosity, I want you to pick a photo that's dominated by reds or blues. So this is a good example of like a sunset photo or something. So we'll go ahead and bring Photoshop back up. Let's go to File and then Open. And let's go to, should have a sample in here. There we go. I'm going to pick this as a sample. Okay, so there's a sunset picture. I'm going to do a curves adjustment. So let me go up to my layer, new adjustment layer, and curves. And on this curves adjustment, I'm going to do a typical S curve. So I'll peg the center. There it is. We'll slightly raise the top part of the image, and we'll slightly lower the bottom part of the image like that. So it's our typical S curve. So we can see the original, and then we can see my post process with the S curve. But we're going to take the curves layer, and we're going to change that curves layer into a luminosity right down here at the bottom. And when we do that, you can see that it's brought out some of the colors really nicely in the final image. So that's luminosity. So I go to File, again, File, Export, Export As. Drop this to 1,000. We'll click on Export. And this one, we'll call it luminosity. And click Save. Now, we can also do something where we provide a little bit of texture in the background. And so this is where we could actually look for some kind of a background texture. So a good way of searching for that, again, using the Creative Commons search, or you could use Unsplash. Unsplash is a great source for free images. And what we want is we want a grunge background or grunge texture. And these are typically images that are kind of like this, with just some dirt or whatever. So let's use this one, for example. So there it is. It lets me download for free. And there it is. Okay. I'm going to bring that image into this image. So to do that, I could copy and paste it, or I could go to File, and then I could choose Place Embedded. And this will let me go find that grunge texture. I think I put it in my downloads folder. There it is. And we can choose Place. So this brings it into my file. And you can actually see in my layer stack that there it is. Let's make it big enough. I'm going to shift it to the side here. And then I want to make it big enough to kind of cover up my image. And there it is. Now I can, once I've placed this image, I can adjust the blending mode on this image. So let's go into multiply, for example. And when I do that, you can see that that texture has then been applied to the image. Now, maybe that doesn't look right. So let's come down here to screen and let's see how that one looks. All right, well, that kind of lightened that up. Now, maybe it's too strong. Again, I can adjust the opacity so that just a little bit of the texture comes through. Now, this may or may not look great, but I want to show you this as a concept so that you learn how you can bring something like texture into a particular image. Now, if you didn't like that, we could also try any one of the other options here to create additional texture. So this one we'll call grunge. So I'll go to File and then Export. Maybe. So I have to commit to my image. There we go. File, Export, Export as, and I'd save this one as grunge. So let's go to 1000. Let's click Export. And we'll call this one grunge. And then I'll click Save there. Okay, so that's worked our way through. And I know there's lots of parts to today, but you'll see as I'm doing this that each one is not that long in terms of steps. So we've worked our way through luminosity, and then we worked our way through grunge. The last two pieces are the HDR image and the panoramic image. So once again, I'll come back to Photoshop. Maybe, there it is. And I'm going to go to File, and then these are automated options. So I'm going to go to File and then Automate. And there's two things, the Merge to HDR Pro and the Photomerge. The Merge to HDR Pro is about the high dynamic range images. So we're going to choose Merge to HDR Pro first. Now, if you don't have the bracketed set of images, you can download a sample set. And if you look down here, there's zip files of HDR samples group 1, 2, 3. Likewise, there's samples of the panoramic images 1, 2, and 3. So you can download those samples and play with those. I already have them downloaded, so I'm not going to waste your time and have you watch me download them. But now that they're downloaded, let me go ahead and browse for them. So let's go into my OneDrive folder. Let's go to live demonstrations here. All right, let's do HDR. Here's sample set 1, and there's 3 images. So I can select all 3 of those images and then say OK. And they'll show up here. And you see that they're consecutive images because that's how I shot them. And we want to make sure that we've checked attempt to automatically align source images. I can go ahead and say OK. Now, Photoshop is going to do some processing. So this is a point at which I need to just kind of wait for it to work through. Okay, so once it has those 3 images put together, it's going to present me with this Merge to HDR Pro little dialog box. And in this dialog box, you'll see that there are a bunch of presets. And I can go through and choose the presets and see if any of those look good to my eye. So I'd encourage you to play around with those. Again, some of them are meant to be kind of surrealistic. Some of them are meant to be realistic. So you can play around with which ones feel right. Actually, the default turned out pretty nice to begin with. There are also options to manually remove things. Here under advanced, if I wanted to adjust just the shadows, for example, I can make the shadows lighter. And you can see that affecting just that the shadows down below. I can make them darker. So you can play around with those sliders to get the results you want. When it's all said and done, you can go ahead and say OK. And it'll actually create the file for you. Give it a second. And there's the final image. So I can save this one as an HDR. Now, I did, in the exercise, I talk a little bit about masking and selectively applying. I think based on where I am and the time, we'll concentrate on masking next class. So I'm not too worried if you don't do anything more than get these merged together. Next piece would be the photo merge. So I'm going to go to File and then Automate. And I'm going to go to Photomerge. Now the Photomerge, this is the panorama where we're sticking images together. I'm going to do the auto layout and I'm going to browse for a set of images. Now, if you download my samples, which are right here, if you download one of those samples, you're going to see that there are a bunch of images that are part of this that all work together. These are full 360-degree panoramas. For our purposes, we don't need nearly that many images. So I'm going to hold down Shift and select maybe those 3. And then let's come in here and select a few more. I'm going to hold down the Control key to, oops, maybe it's, this is one of those when I'm working on. So let's take those 3 and let's add those. And then we'll browse for a few more here. Take those there. And we'll go ahead and add those. So I've added those images. We're going to blend the images together. And we're going to go ahead and say, OK. Now, this takes a little bit of time for Photoshop because it's going to open up all the different images. And it's going to look for similarities in the images and start to align the images based on their content. And so it was able to process the images and kind of stick them together. So you see that the upper images are warped and stuck on top. The lower images are kind of down here in the bottom, but they're relatively seamless. Now we can see over here, let me turn them all off, that what Photoshop has done is it's selectively cut each one of these images so that the image seams together with the image that's next to it. So you can see that there's that cut line. And when I turn this on, there's that next piece. And when I turn that on, there's that next piece. So it's done that as an automatic process for you. And it does that using something called masks. And this is the first time that you're really seeing masks. And we'll spend a bunch of time next class kind of discussing masks. But I'd like to point out that that's what's happening here. So each one of these is controlling what part of this image is seen. So there's our image. And actually, I'm going to right click and say disable it for a second. There's the overall image. So it's been warped. But then Photoshop cuts it out so that it can seam with the other images by creating this little mask that controls what is shown and what is not shown. So let's go ahead and turn these all back on like that. And I'll go ahead and save this one as well. So I'll go to File and then Export As. And this will be my panorama. Again, I'm just dropping the size. For our purposes, we don't need anything gigantic. We'll export, and this would be the panorama. So when you go to make your post on Canvas, you're going to be posting an original image, and then a multiply, a screen, and an overlay, that's 4. A luminosity, that's 5. A grunge, that's 6. Then we have a HDR image, that's 7, and a panoramic image, that's 8. So it'll be 8 total images. It looks like I'm saying 7 images, probably because I didn't include the original. So if you post 7, that's fine. 1 image each for steps 2 to 8. Okay, so I'm going to have you guys post that. We're running up against the start of my first check-in session. So unless anybody has any major questions, I'm going to go ahead and let me stop my share. And does anybody have any questions? And if not, then you guys are free to go. And I'll have my first group kind of stick in.